The room wasn't a rally hall tonight, it was a chapel borrowed by a nation that had run out of language. Fluorescent lights hummed softly above folding chairs, cameras blinked red from the aisles, and along the back wall a row of network anchors whispered into earpieces, waiting for a moment no one could quite define. At the front, a single wooden lectern stood beside a table of candles and a framed photo of Charlie Kirk. Outside, rain tattooed the windows like a metronome for held breath. When Donald Trump walked in, the air shifted the way it does when grief and history brush shoulders. No music, no walk-on line. He paused, looked at the photo, then at the candles, as if measuring a distance only he could see. The audience, students in hoodies, grandparents gripping tissues, staffers with legal pads they'd never open, fell into a hush that felt heavier than silence. Someone in the third row began to cry quietly. A camera zoomed and then stopped, as if afraid to trespass. Trump placed both hands on the lectern. No teleprompter. No rally cadence. "Tonight," he said, voice lower than we've heard it, "America is a family in the hallway of a hospital, waiting, watching, praying." The sentence seemed to land on the wooden floor and stay there. He glanced up. "We don't always agree. We argue, sometimes loudly, but we know how to kneel, and we know how to ask." His breath caught almost imperceptibly on the last word. He bowed his head. "God, we pray for Charlie, for strength in his body, light in his mind, and peace for those who love him. Bless the doctors, steady their hands, bless this country. Steady our hearts." It wasn't a stump speech. It wasn't even politics. It was a petition spoken into a room that had run out of answers. Phones lowered. Palms opened. Across America, living rooms fell quiet as the prayer threaded itself through cables and clouds. When he finished, he didn't step back, he stayed there, eyes closed, as if holding a door open for the rest of us. And then the sound came, not applause, not chants, just the soft, unguarded chorus of people weeping together. It moved like weather, from the front row to the balcony, from the chapel to the country, from strangers to family. Whatever came next would be argued, analyzed, sliced into clips. But this first minute was something else entirely, a nation remembering how to be still. Outside the chapel, satellite trucks lined the street like metallic sentinels. Reporters leaned against umbrellas, trying to stitch sentences out of what they had just witnessed, but most of them admitted off-camera that words felt insufficient. For years, Trump's public appearances had been spectacles of conflict, boisterous rallies, courtroom entrances, combative press scrums. Yet tonight, he carried no thunder, only a fragile prayer that cracked something inside the people who listened. America, tuned in from kitchens, dorm rooms, and office break rooms, found itself unexpectedly unified by silence. Inside, the candles flickered higher, as if drawing breath. Some in the crowd whispered "Amen," others simply closed their eyes. A woman clutched her daughter's hand, whispering, "Remember this sound." It wasn't the sound of politicians, or pundits, or protests, it was the sound of collective mourning disguised as hope. Charlie Kirk's photograph, framed and smiling, became less an image of one man and more a mirror for a nation asking who we are when stripped of noise. Trump opened his eyes. They were red, though whether from fatigue or from the gravity of the moment, no one could be sure. Charlie believed in voices, he said slowly, choosing each word as though it might break in his hands. He believed that one voice could move thousands, and that thousands could move history. Tonight, I ask every American listening, not to fight, not to shout, but to carry his voice until it becomes our own. The line traveled like lightning. Social media feeds erupted instantly, hashtags forming in real time, yet the tone was different, less venom, more reverence. Across the nation, people paused television remotes mid-click. Some who had sworn never to watch him again found themselves unable to turn away. Not because of politics, but because something in the delivery felt stripped bare. Analysts would later argue whether it was strategy or sincerity, but for those present, the distinction evaporated. The prayer had tunneled past suspicion into the marrow of human grief, and from that marrow came tears. In that second act of the night, America wasn't debating walls or courts or polls. It was gathered, unexpectedly, around a single name, Charlie, and around the fragile thread of faith that one leader's prayer could still bind a fractured people. The storm outside intensified, but inside, the room glowed with the rare light of unity, even if only for a heartbeat in history. The newsrooms tried to pivot quickly, but the footage told its own story. On one split screen, anchors gestured toward polls and party fractures, yet the other half of the screen lingered on the image of Trump standing motionless by the candles. The contrast was striking, statistics and strategy clashing against raw humanity. For a country exhausted by constant division, the prayer had become a rupture in the expected narrative. America wasn't being entertained or persuaded, it was being reminded of its capacity to feel. Back in the chapel, a ripple of motion carried through the audience. A young student, no older than 20, rose from her seat and whispered, "Can I say something?" Her voice trembled, but the microphone was offered to her. She stared at the floor, then looked up, her eyes wet but steady. "I came here angry. I didn't think I'd stay. But when I heard those words, 'Steady our hearts,' I thought about my brother. He's serving overseas. And I realized, I need my heart steadied, too." She sank back down, and the room erupted, not in claps or chants, but in murmurs of shared recognition. Trump listened, uncharacteristically quiet. His usual instinct to dominate the moment was absent. Instead, he nodded, as though absorbing not just the girl's story but the weight of hundreds like it across the nation. Cameras caught the expression, not triumphant, not defensive, simply human. It was this moment that reverberated across social media, cut into short clips with captions like, "For once, we all paused," and "A nation hears itself breathe." In the back row, a pastor whispered, "This is no longer about Charlie alone. This is about who we become when we lose someone who believed in us." The words landed like prophecy. Across living rooms in America, families leaned closer to their screens, not to analyze, but to absorb. Even critics who had long dismissed Trump felt the peculiar pull of sincerity, or at least of something larger than politics. For decades, America's fractures had been narrated through debates and headlines. Tonight, for the first time in memory, the fracture was bridged not by arguments, but by silence shared after a prayer. The cameras panned the crowd, strangers holding hands, tears unchecked, eyes lifted toward a photograph that now seemed to hover above the nation like a question. What do we do with this grief? The next wave of emotion came not from Trump, but from the collective energy of the room itself. The hush that followed the student's words thickened into something almost physical, a presence that pressed against the walls and ceiling. Reporters scribbling notes found their pens stuttering, as though ordinary language was too brittle to capture what was unfolding. It wasn't a rally anymore. It had become a vigil broadcast to millions, a vigil that blurred the line between audience and nation. Trump shifted slightly, his hand brushing against the lectern. "When a man like Charlie falls silent," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "the rest of us must speak louder, not with anger, but with love. Not with division, but with courage." The words, simple and deliberate, slid into the air like pebbles into water, sending ripples through those gathered. For a moment, even his harshest critics online hesitated before typing. The atmosphere resisted cynicism. In the back, someone began to hum, a broken tune, low and trembling, like a hymn half remembered. Others picked it up. Within minutes, the chapel was filled with sound, not rehearsed, not polished, but raw, hundreds of voices, uneven yet united, rising through the rafters. Viewers at home typed, "I'm crying," across comment threads, live chats flooded with emojis of candles and hearts. America, fractured by so many walls of politics and culture, was, just for that instant, singing together. The camera caught Trump closing his eyes, not in his usual performance of gravitas, but as though surrendering to the moment. A tear slid down his cheek, one, solitary, but unmistakable. Analysts would later freeze-frame it, dissect it, doubt it. But for those watching live, the image was seared into memory, a leader undone not by opposition, but by vulnerability. When the hymn tapered off, a quiet fell so heavy that even the sound of the rain outside seemed intrusive. Then, from somewhere near the front row, a voice called out, "We are still one people." The line spread like fire, echoed and repeated until it was no longer a voice, but a chant, soft yet unstoppable. This was the hinge of the night, the point where grief turned into something larger, where mourning cracked open the possibility of unity. And whether one believed it genuine or not, America found itself caught in the undertow of a moment too rare to dismiss. As the chant settled into silence, Trump leaned forward again, gripping the lectern with both hands. His voice was hoarse now, stripped of the familiar cadence that usually drew cheers. "I know," he said slowly, almost as if confessing, "that too often we speak past each other. Too often we fight to win an argument instead of to heal a wound. But tonight we are reminded that some wounds cut too deep for politics. Charlie's loss isn't about red or blue, it's about human beings who deserve to feel safe, who deserve to live." The word struck like a tremor. For years, critics had accused him of weaponizing division, of fanning flames. But here, in this chapel, Trump sounded more like a mourner than a fighter. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the unusual humility etched across his face. Headlines forming in real time would later ask, was this the most unguarded moment of his career? A woman stood from the second row, clutching a photograph of Charlie. Her sobs broke the room again. "He just wanted to make a difference," she cried out, her voice echoing against the stained glass. Trump stepped away from the podium, something he rarely did, and approached her. He didn't take the photo, didn't offer platitudes, just placed a hand gently on her shoulder. The gesture alone sent shockwaves. Social media erupted. For once, no slogan, just silence. Meanwhile, outside the chapel, the crowd overflowed into the streets. Thousands gathered in candlelight vigils across Utah and beyond. In New York, Los Angeles, Dallas, screens glowed in the dark, live streams capturing Americans united not by politics, but by loss. This wasn't a rally staged for cameras, it felt like the country itself had paused, breath held, bound together by grief. But grief always carried a question. And as the camera panned back to Trump returning to the stage, the question hung unspoken in the air: would this moment remain sacred, or would it be swallowed by the relentless machinery of headlines and campaigns? Trump's eyes scanned the crowd. "I can't promise you I'll be perfect," he admitted, his voice faltering again. "But I promise you this, I will remember this night. I will remember Charlie. And I will remember that America is watching, not just for words, but for the truth in what we do next." The room didn't cheer. It didn't clap. It just breathed. Together. Outside the chapel, reporters scrambled to capture the moment, their voices urgent into live broadcasts. "This is unlike anything we've seen before. The former president is not rallying, he's grieving with the crowd." Clips of Trump's trembling prayer were already viral, stitched across TikTok, replayed on Twitter, dissected on late-night news. But inside, no one cared about the feeds, they were living in it. A father in the third row, his arm around his teenage son, stood and addressed the stage. "Mr. President," he began, voice cracking, "I didn't vote for you. Never thought I'd agree with you on anything. But tonight, I felt like you were speaking for all of us." The chapel stirred with murmurs. Trump looked directly at him, eyes heavy, and gave a slow nod. For once, he didn't fire back, didn't pivot. He let the words sit as an offering. Meanwhile, the choir softly began a hymn, unplanned, their voices weaving through the grief. Candles flickered in the hands of mourners. And for the first time in years, America seemed to share the same language, not of slogans, not of parties, but of sorrow. Then, as if pulled by instinct, the crowd outside started chanting Charlie's name. Not in anger, not in defiance, but in remembrance. Thousands of voices, rising together into the night sky, "Charlie. Charlie." The sound traveled down streets, across neighborhoods, carried into homes where televisions were muted but hearts were listening. Inside, Trump closed his eyes. His face, often hardened in defiance, softened under the weight of the chant. The cameras caught it all. The man who built his career on being unshaken now looked breakable, human, almost humbled. It wasn't the power of politics holding the room, it was the power of loss. And yet, in that silence, a new tension emerged. Whispers spread through the pews. What would tomorrow bring? Would this night stand alone, remembered as a sacred pause in the chaos, or would it be spun, dissected, twisted into ammunition? Trump opened his eyes, his voice barely above a whisper. "May this be more than a prayer," he said. "May it be a turning point." The words hung in the air, fragile but burning. The crowd leaned in. America held its breath. The next morning, headlines across the country painted a picture that seemed impossible just a day earlier. Trump's prayer moves a nation, from division to mourning, a shared moment, and even from outlets that had long criticized him, a glimpse of humanity amid chaos. But alongside the praise came suspicion. Some commentators claimed it was calculated, a staged attempt to soften his image. Others pushed back, pointing to the raw footage, the tears, the silence that could never be rehearsed. In diners and coffee shops, the conversation was the same. Did you see it? Strangers scrolled through their phones, showing each other clips. A barista whispered, "I didn't think he had it in him." An older man shook his head. It wasn't about him. It was about Charlie. It was about all of us. And so the narrative split, not between left and right, but between cynicism and hope. At a university in Utah, where the tragedy had struck, students held a vigil. Many wore shirts that read, "Steady our hearts." The phrase, lifted from Trump's prayer, had already become a symbol, appearing on signs, on social media banners, even spray-painted across walls downtown. What was meant to be a few words whispered in grief had transformed into a national refrain. Meanwhile, Trump's advisors gathered in a private room, debating furiously. "We need to capitalize on this," one urged. "This could change everything." But others warned, the moment only works if it stays pure. If he weaponizes it, he loses it. Trump sat quietly at the head of the table, for once not dictating, not interrupting. He was replaying the prayer in his mind, the way the words felt heavier than any speech he'd ever given. Across the country, churches reported larger crowds that Sunday. Not all came to pray for Charlie Kirk specifically, many came searching for connection, for the pause they had seen on their screens. A pastor in Texas said it best, "It wasn't the man on stage that moved us. It was what we saw in each other." Grief cracked us open, and for a second, the walls came down. By evening, hashtags like #SteadyOurHearts and #AmericaWeepsTogether trended worldwide. For once, the noise of politics was drowned out by the sound of mourning. And in that fragile unity, a question began to rise: could a single prayer really alter the course of a nation? Or was it just a flicker, brief, beautiful, and doomed to fade? That night, CNN aired a special titled "The Prayer That Stopped the Room." The program replayed the footage uncut, resisting the usual habit of splicing commentary over every frame. The silence before the prayer, the tremor in Trump's voice, the tear streaking down the cheek of a young woman in the crowd, it all played exactly as it had unfolded. Millions tuned in, not to hear pundits, but to relive that moment raw. At the same time, Fox News ran its own segment, dubbing it "A Turning Point for America." Their panel speculated that history would look back on this as the day Trump found a language beyond politics. But MSNBC countered, calling it a "rare human slip" from a man defined by bravado. The disagreement only fueled the conversation, making the prayer impossible to ignore. But beyond the studios, something subtler stirred. In a dimly lit apartment in Ohio, a mother clutched her teenage son. He had been thinking about dropping out of college, cynical about a country he saw as broken. Watching Trump pray for Charlie Kirk, his walls cracked. "If even he can stop and feel," the boy whispered, "maybe I gave up too soon." His mother didn't reply, she just hugged him tighter, silently grateful. In Salt Lake City, candles burned outside the university's main hall, stretching into the streets. Some were lit by Trump supporters, others by students who had never voted for him. For a few hours, they stood shoulder to shoulder, mourning not just Charlie but every loss, every scar the country had carried. It wasn't unity in ideology, it was unity in pain. Inside Trump's team, however, tension brewed. Some advisors pressed him to prepare a speech expanding on his prayer. Others warned against speaking again too soon, insisting that silence might preserve the sacredness of the moment. Trump himself felt torn. For perhaps the first time in years, he wasn't sure if more words would strengthen him, or undo him. Meanwhile, social media only amplified the weight. Short clips of his prayer spread like wildfire, overlaid with piano music, remixed into reels, even tattooed into artwork. Artists painted murals with Charlie's face surrounded by the phrase, "Steady our hearts." For once, memes weren't mocking, they were mourning. The prayer was no longer just his. It belonged to the people now. By morning, America woke to headlines that seemed almost unreal. The prayer that united a fractured nation. From politics to prayer, Trump's unexpected moment. For once, the news wasn't dominated by scandal, outrage, or division, it was centered on a single, unplanned act of vulnerability. Even critics admitted the raw humanity could not be denied. At universities, professors paused their lectures to discuss it. Some called it performance, others called it sincerity, but all agreed it struck a chord too deep to ignore. In coffee shops from Boston to Phoenix, strangers who once avoided politics spoke openly about what it meant to them. Not about Trump, not even about Charlie Kirk, but about grief, faith, and the need for hope in a violent, spiraling age. The White House press corps, usually relentless, softened for a day. Instead of barbed questions, they asked what Trump meant when he prayed, "Steady our hearts." He shrugged off the politics of it, saying simply, "We're human before we're anything else." That line replayed almost as much as the prayer itself, written across op-eds and echoed in church sermons. But not everyone saw it as a moment of healing. Protesters gathered outside government buildings, holding signs that read, "We don't need words, we need action." To them, the prayer felt hollow, a distraction from policy, justice, and reform. Their chants echoed through the night, a reminder that unity, however fleeting, is fragile. And yet, in living rooms across America, people sat together who hadn't in years. Families split by politics watched the replay, some in silence, some with tears. In a small town in Kentucky, an elderly veteran turned off the TV and told his granddaughter, "That wasn't a president talking. That was just a man." She nodded, unsure why those words carried so much weight, but knowing she'd remember them. For Trump, the paradox was immediate. The prayer had given him something he'd long struggled to capture. Authenticity. But with authenticity came responsibility. The world was watching, not just what he said, but what he did next. And for the first time, silence seemed louder than any campaign speech he'd ever given. The question on everyone's mind now wasn't what had just happened. It was, what comes after? The following Sunday, churches across the country rang with a strange unity. Pastors quoted not scripture, but the words from that night, "Steady our hearts." In cathedrals, in modest chapels, even in open-air gatherings, the phrase carried like a hymn. America wasn't healed, but for the first time in a long time, it seemed to pause, to breathe. In Salt Lake City, thousands attended a candlelight vigil at the university where tragedy had struck. Charlie Kirk's name was spoken not with politics, but with grief. Families who had lost children to violence stood side by side with students who barely knew him, each holding flames that flickered against the cold. At the front, a speaker recited Trump's prayer word for word, and the crowd whispered the ending in unison, "Steady our hearts." For a moment, silence swept over them like a tide. Meanwhile, in Washington, Trump watched the vigil broadcast alone in the residence. His advisors urged him to prepare a follow-up speech, to seize the momentum. But he didn't reach for his notes. He just leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the flickering lights, and whispered, "Let them have this one." For critics, the prayer would remain theater. For supporters, it would be proof of compassion. But for the people who lit candles, who cried in their kitchens, who held their families tighter that week, the truth was simpler. It was a reminder that words, when stripped of ego, could still cut through the noise. America was still divided. The violence had not vanished. The arguments would return, as they always did. But stitched into the memory of a broken week was one fragile thread, a president who stopped speaking like a politician and, for a fleeting moment, spoke like a man. And whether history would judge it as performance or sincerity, one fact remained: America wept together, and the nation would not forget how it felt.